Good evening. I guess the big question is all the technology going to keep working for 3 hours? That's the real challenge of this thing. More than any difficulty in information, it's always the technology that's the issue. So I'm glad that you're going to spend the evening here. This thing's just gone off again, so you may be getting a call from him. So, the subject matter, as you know, what do I do with it? Joint forces. Everybody's familiar? Some? Little? A lot? Maybe? And chain mechanics. And I don't even want to necessarily say closed chain yet, because there really is much more to it than that. But it, across time, has really just become about one thing, and you don't have to dig very deep to find out that none of us know very much about that one thing. We've been taught a lot. We've been told to repeat a lot, but there's not a lot of reality in what we've been taught, what we've learned, and even what the textbooks offer. And you can even go back to the guy who they say coined the phrases closed chain and open chain and find out that he was about 100 years behind. So let's start with joint forces. And I think it's really important to have a very clear view of the basics, the most fundamental things, because without those, it really seems that without the fundamentals, we just get tripped up all the time. So everybody starts wondering who's right instead of being able to discern who's making the most sense. Does this really apply to the people we are working with? Because ultimately, that's the biggest challenge in this thing. For all the papers that we read, for all the research supposedly done, does it really ever apply to the person sitting in front of us? That's the only way that any of this stuff matters, ultimately. So I was taught to be afraid of joint forces. That's not me, but somebody's afraid of something, right? And I think the biggest reason we're afraid of joint forces, and they've been used in scary stories of how ACLs have exploded across the whole world with certain exercises and all these terrible things that have happened. And I'm not sure all these stories are true. And sometimes when we take these scary things, we just need to step back and look at what's really going on, and it's just not that bad. In fact, turns out we're going to find that joint forces are really important. Maybe you already knew that, but that's not the way it's typically brought up. So, as an example, as an analogy, are hammers good or are hammers bad? Are they scary? Your thumb might think your hammer's scary, you know, depending on whether you hit the nail with your thumb or not, right? Ultimately, hammers can be used in construction. Hammers can be used to demolish things. I think we're going to find that to be a theme here. Hammers can occasionally be used to fly. I have not found that to be true for myself, but I'm hoping someday, although I'm not that excited about going that high. But anyway, this is an interesting analogy. This road is so smooth. Can you see? If you were driving on it, it would just feel like glass. And when they built this road, they used tons of force to compact the materials in hopes that it's not only smooth, but that it lasts a long time. If you think about a correlation with our bodies, it is force that improves bone density. It is force used appropriately that makes tissue stronger. So right away, we should start to feel a little less afraid of the word force, even before we start talking about joints. But certainly, force could easily ruin this road. So is it that forces are good or forces are bad? I think it's quite obvious that appropriate forces are phenomenal and important, and they can also, when they become inappropriate, duration's too long, amount of force is too much, it's too abrupt, we can have some trouble with this thing. So as I was looking through the internet, and you got to stop at some point because it just gets ridiculous, all the things you find about force. But I started wondering about diamonds. Did you ever hear that diamonds are made from coal that was under a lot of heat and force? So I was looking for that, and this came up, and I thought this was interesting. They're both made of carbon. I think we knew that. They're made from different qualities of sources of carbon at different layers within the earth. So they're making the point that diamonds and coal aren't close enough related for one to be made from the other. But I think the analogy was simply that they're made from the same thing, and that what's required to make them is very different. And as it mentions right here, while they're not the same, diamonds require more heat and more what? Force, ultimately force. So I think there is still some reality in this. What we're going to find for us that's so incredibly important about joint forces are what move us. Everything except the blinking you're doing right now, which doesn't really exactly have a joint, but every movement you've performed all day long was made from forces. So forces move us and forces hold us together. I like that little kid a lot right there. He's my new favorite kid. So our joints are held together purely by force, the force from tissue, the force from externals. Forces are going to move us. We need to start looking at the names of a lot of forces, because I've heard them used interchangeably, and maybe it would be a little more clear if we start looking with what load is. Because load is the force that is put on a structure, on a body. Stress is the force created inside of the structure under load. And if you have two structures that are touching, there's a joint, right? An articulation, a place where they meet. And that's really where we're focusing right now, because any force put on the objects will end up meeting in some way right there on those red lines. So two forces in that direction. And when I say in that direction, I don't mean up and down. I mean relative to what? Relative to the plane of the joint. So those forces are obviously going to cause what we've come to call compression. Forces that are pulling that direction would create what they often call distraction. And everybody's favorite force ever is shear. That's the one that really started all these conversations about force. Nobody cared about it prior to that. So shear often gets confused with motion. And I think it's really important to recognize that none of these forces are movement, but they certainly can produce it. So a shearing force could produce a motion in that direction, but you can have forces without moving. Because we're all seated or standing and not moving because whatever's underneath us is meeting that same force. So obviously motion is not a guaranteed outcome of having forces, right? Here's a word we need to talk about, because if you start exploring shear outside of the body, just as a general physics-based force, you'll find really quickly that the opposition to shear is called friction. So when you have two surfaces, any kind of objects, touching, there is the possibility of having friction between those things. And there are several factors, including what's called a coefficient of friction of the material itself. So we typically consider something like ice to have a really low coefficient of friction. That's why we're more careful on it often. As opposed to something like, well, even your, sometimes your cell phone case now has that rubbery stuff, so it's not quite as slick, so it has a higher coefficient of friction. So certainly that's a possibility. This is one of the places where when we learn about these things from general physics, we've got to sit back and go, but wait, inside of us, we have specific materials surrounding our joints, the whole purpose of which is to eliminate as much friction as possible. So we know that you have the hyaline cartilage around here, and if you've ever seen it or touched it, it's incredibly slick. And it is said to have an even lower coefficient than ice. I don't know how they come up with those things. I'm not going to challenge them. Let's just say it's pretty slick, okay? And what's secreted when everything's working correctly to make it even slicker? That synovial fluid. So as soon as we start moving, it starts getting that little bit of lubricant on this, and the whole purpose of that is to not have friction. So then why aren't we just sliding apart all the time if we have shear that's unopposed by friction? Well, I was thinking one time about this. I had a physics class in high school, and this was the picture they used to show relationships. And with this picture, the teacher was presenting gravity, and gravity is not pushing straight down into that joint. It's not creating purely compression. It's not creating purely shear. It actually has kind of a division of its influences. So some of it's smashing some of that stuff together, and some of it's trying to slide it down the triangle. So when we go look at the joint itself, there is a portion of that force of gravity that's creating compression. And there's a portion that's trying to slide the block down the hill. What's inside of us? We've got not so much friction, but we have tissue. We have things that tether our joints together. We have ligaments, we have muscles, we have a lot of things specifically designed, but it can't be exactly like that because it has to move. We are supposed to move. We're just not supposed to come apart. So it's this perfect relationship of tissues and their arrangements around our oddly shaped joints that are going to allow this thing to do what it's supposed to do with hopefully frictionless surfaces inside, stop when it's supposed to stop, move as fast as we can make it move humanly possible, like some Olympic sprinter. And it's really amazing how all that works. So we've got components in the same way that gravity played a role in smashing the joint surfaces together, and also all by itself played another role that could possibly move the thing. Our muscles, for example, inside of us play multiple roles. So if we take a look at this glenohumeral joint, there we go. If this was the angle that the muscle was trying to pull on the humerus, it's really creating two different influences around that axis. Everybody's probably familiar with this. Does this sound familiar, or did you skip this day in school, or intentionally? I don't blame you. I don't even remember it from school. I had to pick it up later. So you've got a little bit of force right here that's going to actually start rotating this thing. That's why it's called the rotational component. And we got a little bit bigger force here, the blue one, that's called a translatory component. And the reason they are the length that they are is because of this angle that the deltoid is pulling. So what would really happen right now, there's much more blue force than there is green moving force. What this deltoid right now is really trying to do is slide this apart. As good as it is at moving us, it's really trying to do this right now. And that's really not a huge concern. We've survived that for quite some time, as long as everything else is working well. So as we get to different points in the range, though, what's the blue force? This would be creating shear. Can you envision that? Because of the relationship with the plane of the joint. Now, the same force that was creating shear over here is creating what? Well, in this place, the deltoid pulling that way is creating compression. So what a muscle does changes as we go through the range of motion. When we analyze one position, when we're afraid of one position, due to the scary stories that we've heard about joint forces, we really need to sit back and look through the entire range that this thing could be doing its job and realize that there's a lot more going on. And through a significant portion of this motion, that same force that was trying to tear us apart before is trying really hard to hold us together right now. And if you put everything else with that, like rotator cuff muscles, you start to see how everything stays together due to everything that's going on. So it is always, 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 almost. It is always important to remember that we have more things holding us together than we do trying to tear us apart. This thing was built really well. And unless we start doing really ridiculous things to it, or unless some of the important features become compromised and don't hold us together the way they're supposed to, there's really not much reason to worry about these things. This picture, it may be hard to tell. This is the femur. Let me see. So what you're looking at is a femur, a tibia. This is the hamstring, biceps femoris long head. This is one portion of the gastroc. So you can kind of get an idea of where you are. And it's really, 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 really nice that there's this overlapping relationship in muscles. So many times I hear people talk about knee flexion and hamstrings as if it's the sole provider of knee flexion. And I don't know how it started getting so popular in that way, because the gastroc, that we always think of as being a plantar flexor, is a phenomenal knee flexor, and in some ways more important for holding us together than the hamstring. So to dismiss the value of either of these and to think a leg curl exercises for hamstrings is completely missing the vast majority of what's going on inside of there, the really important stuff. So if the hamstring's pulling that way, it's creating a little bit of that green rotational force, that thing that moves us. But at this point in time, it's bringing the joint together. By the time we get to 90-ish degrees of knee flexion, it's my favorite word, ish. Put it at the end of everything. It means kind of. You're good with that, right? One of the students from Brazil came up one time. When was that? 4 or 5 years ago. He was great at English. And he goes, stop. What is this ish you keep saying all the time? I said, oh, I'm sorry. It means kind of. He goes, okay. So there, that's your Oklahoma English lesson for the day. So the hamstring now is doing what? Pulling it that direction with the knee in this position. So it's pulling that way. It's got nothing to do with holding us together. It's trying to do this. If it was the only thing, 2 bones and that muscle, this is what would happen. I'm betting there's something else going on there. Maybe a lot of things going on there. And while there are certainly many, many more influences from the front, from the ligamentous structures on the inside, the thing I want you to appreciate is what the gastroc is doing right now. Because it is pulling that knee together while performing knee flexion. It has a tremendous torque generating ability at the knee. So when we say it's an assistant mover, I can't stand that word. You can use it if you want to. I won't feel bad at all. It's okay. But it kind of is demeaning. It's kind of putting the gastroc at a lower status of knee flexor when you say it's an assistant mover. It's like, it's not an assistant. It's a main guy, you know. Give it some credit. So we do that a lot with muscles. Our kinesiology books, so we've learned assistant movers and prime movers. The problem is, if I take a knife and take any assistant mover and cut it loose, we're done. We don't understand the value of these things we call assistants. And I think it's a shame to even name them that. So there's some important relationships to think about relative to holding us together. We're going to do something that I do in class, and usually spend a little more time doing it, and have a whiteboard so we can draw, and then it becomes almost like a math class for a little bit. But I want to show you an influence in shear. And this is going to become important because in the end, after we talk about open chains and closed chains. We're going to talk about things like leg extensions. Because if you take all of these subjects and the reason anybody's talking about them in the first place, it boils down to, are leg extensions good or are leg extensions bad? For all of this stuff, it boils down to, quite frankly, a really childish question. Because there's no such thing as a good or bad exercise. Are we doing it with the right person, with the right amount of load, built the right way, with the right support, with the right control, it's about 100 things that can make a scenario really bad with what is even thought of as a good exercise. The exercise is not bad. The hammer did not hurt your thumb. It was not its fault. It's not the exercise's fault necessarily. So, what is this? Let's pretend this is like a shoulder in terms of its structure. So you can envision maybe a humeral head and maybe a glenoid. So, something like that. And that. So, and you can see this is very shallow. It's not a deep, deep socket. Even though they call it a ball and a socket, it's just annoying. It's like a basketball sitting on a saucer in your kitchen. That's how deep it's not, you know, it's no good. Now, if you had a basketball inside of your mixing bowl, that's a hip. That's a pretty good ball and socket. This thing needs help to stay together. So, obviously, this is going to be like an elbow type of a joint, maybe. We're going to say this is 20 somethings away, inches, centimeters, miles, if it's a really tall person. And this is 10 somethings out here. And it doesn't matter what they are, pounds, kilograms, none of it matters. It's the relationships and the proportions. That's why it doesn't matter what the actual volume or lengths or weights are. So what does that make? If we were looking at this thing called torque, and if we were calling this a moment arm, because it is, that would be about 200 inch-pounds, Newton meters, whatever the situation is. Everybody good with that? Somewhere over there is something that might be like a muscle that's pulling at some angle. Maybe like this muscle. Maybe. And it's only 5 inches away from the axis. So obviously it's at this big mechanical disadvantage. It's going to have to work really hard. Its angle of pull makes it have to work even harder, because in order to create this vertical force that's going to fight this vertical weight in opposite directions, while leaning at that angle, most of this thing's force is going to be going towards the joint rather than actually trying to lift. It's going to be doing what? Helping to hold us together. Now, how much that helps is going to be based upon how deep this is. And it's not very deep, but at least it's not flat. So there is some concave nature to it that gives us some assistance if the thing's held together correctly. So, the big question now, what number? How much does this muscle have to pull upward in order to hold this weight statically? Well, we're going to have to come up with the same 200 inch-pounds, whatever it is. So in order to do that, it's going to have to pull upward with about 40 pounds of force to hold a 10-pound weight. And that's not the muscle's entire effort. The muscle's pulling that direction. If this muscle was attached at 30 degrees, it's going to have to pull with about 80 pounds of internal tension to produce that 40, if we went through the trigonometry stuff. So, what's the point? Well, one of the first things I like to recognize is that muscle is doing more to hold you together than it is to pull you apart. But right now, that 40 that's holding the weight is trying to pull you apart. It is trying to move that joint that direction. Do you see that last little arrow over there? That guy? So, we're going to need something, somewhere, pulling downward. You remember those rotator cuff muscles I drew on that other picture. Those arrows become vital in this scenario. Anything else that can pull down over there. Even if there's a little bit of joint structure right up here that keeps this from sliding upward, that joint structure becomes vital. How much upward force is there? How much upward shear is there in this thing? Well, a 10-pound weight with an arm that's 20 inches long is going to have about 30 pounds of shear upward. And what I'd like to do is a little experiment here in a minute and show you how that works, if you're interested. It might fail miserably, which means it might be funny. So that would save the whole evening from being entirely boring. And if the experiment works, then we learn something, which is not nearly as fun. But what if we change something? Before we do the experiment, what if we change something? What if we move the weight in here? Have you ever done that with an ankle weight? Someone's got an ankle weight at their ankle, and you move it up towards their, let's say, halfway to their knee. Now, in order to have the same actual resistance, you'd also have to do what? Because you made the moment arm, you moved it closer to the knee, so you're going to have to go up and weight a little bit, right? If you moved it half the distance to the knee, you're going to have to double the weight. Everybody's pretty good with that leverage stuff? So there's 10. We doubled the weight, so we've still got 200. We've still got the same muscle, pulling at the same angle. But what's the shear? 20. All we did, we actually added more weight. You would think more weight, that would be scary. But more weight at half the distance is the same actual resistance. You with me? But the joint forces are actually improved. So would the exercise be scary? Or is it something we can alter the scariness of if we understand a little bit of the relationships? And by the way, if you're worried about shear ever in any joint, it's the shoulder you should be worried about it in. The knee is built to deal with it. The shoulder is not. The knee's got two massive ligaments running right through the middle. It's the only joint that's interrupted with a valley, the sole purpose of which is to put ligaments to deal with shear. That doesn't mean they can't be torn. Anything doing its job, if the job gets too tough, it can be torn up. But the shoulder is by far the bigger place to worry about shear, especially from the exercise world, and even more so from the sports world. So there's an interesting lesson there, and if it's still a little confusing, let me show you another example. If I were to move the weight into here, into where the 5 is, how much weight would I have to put in order to keep our same torque of 200? So if I do that, you see why 10 and 20 and 40 are the exact same resistance? Now realize, because this is not a real picture, I am discounting the weight of the arm. We are leaving the weight of the arm out of the picture. So in reality, we'd have a little tougher numbers to figure out than this little scenario I've created for us to get an idea of what's going on. Okay? So here we are, 5 and blah, blah, blah. Oh, and there's a muscle still at 5. Now wait a minute. Should be pretty obvious how much upward force and downward force, they undo each other. This has 0 shear. So if you go back and look through the whole thing, the big challenging part of shear, number one, it is joint specific. Never will we ever have to worry about shear in that. This is not going anywhere without a lot of work the other way. Are you with me? So that's, I never hear anybody worry about shear. Oh, did you hear about the shear problem on their hip? No, because there's not one. Okay, good. So we hear about it here all the time. Could there be one? Sure. From exercise? No. I never hear anybody talk about shear here. That's unfortunate. We've been distracted by something we shouldn't have been for so long, when the most susceptible joint to shear has been ignored. Most of the exercises we do in a gym will end up taking its toll at the shoulder relative to shear. And especially the ones where your arm is completely straight with the lightest weight you're going to lift, but it's the light weight concurrent with a lot of muscular force to hold that light weight due to the poor leverage. That's what creates the shear. So it still is nothing to be afraid of, but it gives us a lot of reasons to start re-examining the exercises. We're only afraid of some exercises because of the campfire stories that we were told when we were coming up in the exercise world, like that second slide I showed you. We're not afraid of them because of anything necessarily proven. We're afraid of them because of the stories. And the people that have created the stories also don't seem to understand that changes in the way we apply the resistance, changes in things like inertial effects, changes in where we place it on the limb can totally alter these outcomes. And the place we should learn to do that the most is in and around the shoulder. Or at least that's what the math shows us. That's what the structure shows us, the architecture. So maybe we'll head down that road someday. But I want you to keep in mind these things. What happens in terms of joint forces, the actual outcome, starts with the way the load, the way the resistance is applied. Where is it applied on the limb? And we've been talking about what? We've been talking about holding it still. Do you know if you move something, everything changes. The forces have to change dramatically. And the more abruptly you move it and the more abruptly you stop it, the more dramatic the forces go. Does that make sense? So if I was lowering my arm with a weight in it and stopped it abruptly like that, the forces went up exponentially. We're just looking at the easy ones, the simple ones. The least of the forces is when we're sitting still. So how the resistance is applied, its direction, its placement, etc. The shear we looked at was actually caused by the muscle. People want to blame exercises. I'm going to look at the leg extension a little bit. But the direction of shear that everybody's worried about is anterior. The machine's pushing posterior. It's your muscles causing the shear. It's not the leg extension. So as soon as we start saying an exercise causes that, we need to rethink it. Because it's the scenario created by the exercise and responded to by the muscles. The muscles always are exerting more force than the resistance is because they're closer to the joint. They have terrible mechanical advantage. They have to work really hard to do a little bit. So when they're doing a lot, it goes up exponentially. So, and here was the big thing that we kept mentioning, the architecture of the joint and what position it's in. Just like I was showing, whether you're here or whether you're here, and how the forces are applied and the muscular response, those two things were entirely different in terms of whether it's shear or more compression and that kind of thing. So those outcomes, how these relationships change, we're going to take a look later, actually pretty soon, and see if we could recreate a leg extension that completely altered the joint forces while still doing the same job. It's entirely possible. We have to understand how to manipulate all the factors. And that to me is what really makes this a fun puzzle rather than just a bunch of memorization. Now, would you like to analyze a textbook rather than just believing them blindly? This was one of my favorite textbooks my whole life. It's called Joint Structure and Function, and I still love it. But this is from the fourth edition. No longer written by the original authors. They've brought in new authors for each chapter has a different author now. And some things have been lost along the way. Now, some of this is a matter of understanding the specifics of the words that are being used here. But the other thing I want to show you is a much bigger issue, and hopefully you'll see what I mean. This picture is straight from the book. It says, with the knee, talking about this side, with the knee close to full extension, a forceful quadricep contraction is capable of inducing an anterior tibial translation. Everybody that I have read that looks at it and goes, okay. Do you see the glaring problems with that? No, sounds pretty good. Okay, well, let's think about this. First of all, with the knee close to full extension, that's at about, I don't know, 60 degrees. Is that close? I don't know. There's closer. How about at 60 degrees? Because does it get worse if we get closer to full extension? Does it get better if we get further from this position, further from extension? It doesn't tell us enough to make any sense. And then what is a forceful contraction? Define forceful contraction. It's not a number. I can't do anything with forceful contraction. Can a forceful contraction lift a feather? Well, sure, Tom. If a feather's light, it has to be more forceful than that. It can lift the leg. Okay, so it's, but is it 10 pounds? Is it 100 pounds? Is it, all I'm saying is this doesn't mean anything, a forceful contraction. Let's go on. Here's the bigger problem. Anterior tibial translation. What is translation? It's motion. This picture cannot show us motion. The arrows are not showing us motion. They're showing us forces. What they're depicting, the words they're using, none of this represents anything remotely accurate. It represents a misunderstanding by an author. And a pretty low-level one. And I'm sorry, but the problem is I think when you write a book like this, you have a responsibility. I think if you are an editor of a book like this, you have a responsibility. And this is really, really, really simple miscommunication and misrepresentation of that picture. And it happens in every single biomechanics book. So, what is anterior tibial translation? Well, if I go over here and look at this arrow, that's anterior, and that's the tibia, so that must be it. But the problem is, that's that little green rotational force I drew on all those pictures for you. That is a force that may or may not be producing motion. By the way, translation is a linear motion. You follow me? So if we check someone's, ACL in the old days, and we'd pull forward, and if it translated the anterior drawer sign, because translation is a linear movement as opposed to a rotary movement. Well, that was supposed to be indicative that the ACL wasn't doing its job. But there's no ACL drawn on there, so I would expect there to be all kinds of fancy translation when there's no fancy ACL drawn on there. And I know that this picture is supposed to show us something, but they haven't figured out what it is yet. And it gets worse. Because they come down here and say, once the knee is flexed to greater than 60. Oh, that was 60 after all. Okay, thanks. Little to no anterior translation occurs. That, again, is the rotational component. It is an anteriorly directed force, that's true. It does not represent the motion called translation. And it's not the translatory, even if they're confused about, wait, are they confused about translatory motion being the same as translatory force? No, because this little guy, the F sub x, that's the translatory component of forces. So I know they're not talking about that. They're very clearly talking about this one. And they're very clearly trying to indicate that that force has less ability to produce anterior motion, and this force has more ability to produce anterior motion. And we don't know that. And there's a much bigger problem. There's no resistance drawn on here. I don't even need a quadricep contraction. Why is that a big deal? Because look at this. Can you envision if you were sitting on a treatment table right now with your leg bent 90 degrees, like this? How much resistance is there? I'm actually not completely sitting. Oh, it's the glass. It'll break. It'll be okay. How much resistance do I have right now? How much resistance? 0. Right? Because it's just balanced below my knee. So what happens when I get out here? Is there more resistance? Yes. Would my quadricep be working harder here than here? Yeah. And by the time I get out here, there's a lot more resistance. My quadricep would have to work a lot harder. So what do arrows do? When they draw vectors, what do those vectors represent? 3 things. Vectors in biomechanics, in anything, represent 3 things. Point of application of a force, direction of a force, and what's the third one? Relative magnitude. What does that mean? An amount. So an arrow that's this long and an arrow that's this long, that's the same amount of force. An arrow that's this long and an arrow that's this long, that's twice as much force. Are you with me? So what they're saying is you can straighten your leg, but it's not going to require any more quadricep contraction. Because the arrow over there on the left, the one with a Q on it, that should be about twice as long as it is right now. Which would make that picture and all the relative proportions of each arrow even more dramatic. Do you follow me? So if they would add, it's impossible to talk forces of muscular involvement without talking about forces of resistance, because it is the resistance that demands muscular involvement. And right now, there is no resistance, and right now there is some. Those cannot be the same quadricep arrows. And if this wasn't just gravity, and it was a machine that was even marginally well built by someone who knows how to make a leg extension machine, there would be more resistance applied here than here. And the very lightest point of application of resistance would be when you're all the way straight, which means the quadricep would be working less when you're all the way straight if the machine was built well. Less than at the start. So, what does that mean? That means this helps us in no way learn anything about joint forces, the components that produce shear, which by the way this one would be, because it doesn't take us all the way to the resistance application. And that's where it all has to start, every time. Joint forces are created primarily by muscles in response to resistance. Without those 2 things, we've got nothing to look at. So, that was probably partially confusing, but I really want you to start looking at things like that, in that way, rather than just trying to absorb them, because it doesn't mean they're right just because they're in a book. So, any questions about that? This thing we did up here, kind of quickly earlier, sometimes it's helpful to have some real numbers involved in this thing. So here's what we're going to do. And you can come up here and watch closer if you want to, or maybe that's a dangerous place to be and you should stay at the back. I don't know. No protective eyewear. Okay. So everybody's familiar with just a tug of war, right? 2 sides, rope. If we change the tug of war a little bit and we had one person pulling this way and 2 people, here, hold that one, and 2 people pulling, you don't get that one, you get this one. You're not very scientific. So if we did a tug of war like that, which, believe it or not, is exactly what's happening up there. But can you envision that if this was 20, this should be 10 and 10? Does that make sense? If we're the right distance, if we're equal between you. And what do you think would happen if this muscle, if this orange one was closer to this? Well, if this is 20, this has to still be 20. But what happened to the proportions? They would probably change. Because he's having a little tougher tug of war with this bottom rope than he is the top rope. So it might be 20, this might be 5, and this might be 15. Do you see what I mean? And what that would represent is this 5 would be like the weight up there. And this muscle is really close to, let's call this the joint. Something has to be pulling down at the joint. Because the muscle's right next to it, pulling really hard trying to lift this little weight. It's really working harder trying to do this than it is doing that. Does that make sense? So we're going to do a little experiment, and we're going to play that game, and see what happens. Don't laugh. You can laugh. We're all going to laugh when it doesn't work. If this hits me in the face, you can really laugh. You never did this in school, did you? Your classes probably do. Now, you remember what numbers you're supposed to read?
Yeah.
Anyway, okay, just checking. That's just scientific verification. So we have a 4 kilo weight, and I am just about in the middle right there. So what does this one say, Leandro?
7.
About 7. What does yours say, Eli?
It's about 3.5.
So roughly, and these are not exactly expensive scientific pieces of equipment. They're just kind of for fish, right? So with that in mind, it's true. We have 4, and what did you say? Roughly 4, 3.5, and this was about 7 or 8 or something like that. So it was split pretty even. Does that make sense? So now if we're going to go over here, and I'm going to be really close. Are you ready?
15.
What are you?
11.
Ooh, that's perfect. This was 4. That's 11. I'm 15. You see what I mean? So he was all the features of muscle or joint structure that were helping to hold the joint together. If I was the muscle pulling upward and he wasn't there, that joint would be coming apart. Does that make sense? So whew, all the stress is over for the whole day now, right? Nobody died? Numbers are good?
Not yet.
That's a successful day. Way better than Columbus and all those explorers and stuff. They killed a lot of people. Okay. I feel better. Okay. What are we doing now? Oh, there's too many words on these slides, but that's the problem with chains is chain mechanics. It all fell apart way back in the definitions. And everybody has been trying to figure out the original guy's definition and how to apply it. And the first person that did that created some kind of snowball that has just gotten worse and worse and worse. The first example was wrong. And nobody went back and said, I don't even like that other guy. Let's see what we think about this. They just keep using the same stuff over and over and over. And 50 years later, everybody's going, well, I'm not sure this makes sense. And they go back and look, but they don't go back far enough. They're still living within the world of the first mistake. Does that make sense? It'd be like literally, it's like, let's say that I just met you at a party, and you told me your name, and I didn't hear it right. And I told everybody else your name was the wrong name. And everybody comes up and starts saying, hey, wrong name, right? And then like an hour later, it's like, I don't even know what to do about this. And then 3 weeks later, someone said, hey, I met wrong name at the party. And so your whole rest of your life, you're stuck with that name. Nobody went back to your birth certificate. They don't know. Same deal. Okay. Here's what this, have you heard this name before at the top right there? Steinler? Because anything that was ever written in any textbook ever about this, that guy's name is on it. This is of the 2 pages or so where he tried to explain what he meant in his book in 1955. This is the only line that's ever taken out of it and used as a quote over and over and over and over. A closed kinetic chain. By the way, what's kinetic mean? It's a study of forces. There are also closed kinematic chains. Kinematic's the study of motion. So those things get used interchangeably also, it seems, that nobody really goes back to pay attention to that. In everyday language, kinetic means movement. In science, it's the study of forces producing movement. So they're not the same things. And this is more of the engineering science-based version of the word. A closed kinetic chain is one in which the terminal joint meets with some considerable external resistance which prohibits or restrains free motion. Well, that's the shortest thing we're going to read today about these definitions. So if that's worth going back and looking at the pieces, because the pieces are the problem. The terminal joint. How many? The terminal joint. How many ends does this have? 2. 1, 2. You know what terminal means? The end. Which one's the terminal joint? We already got a problem. The terminal joint. What do you mean the? There's 2. Here, take the object. How'd you know which one? There's 2. You can't take the object. You can either steal them both, or I mean, you get, you know. It's a problem already. How about this? People struggle with this. I've got about 40 books on this stuff. Some of them are really struggling. First of all, most people that have written their own book on this call his description incomplete. One of the things they argue over is what considerable resistance means. Someone would say, literally, says this in a book that's supposedly entitled something like The God's Gift to Closed Chains or something. I don't remember what it's called. But he talks about, okay, if someone's riding a stationary bicycle, is it closed chain or not? And one guy says, no, because that's not considerable resistance. How do you know how much resistance is on the bike? What if he's, and isn't resistance relative? If it's 5 pounds but you can't lift it, is it still a lot? This is the, and that cannot be one of the defining features of this thing. The more important thing is this. Whoops. No, stop. Right here. It's not what considerable resistance is, it's what the resistance creates. It prohibits or restrains free movement. That's really the point. It's not how much. Does it get in the way of this thing just flopping around anywhere it wants to go? That's really the point. That's going to be a big piece of the puzzle in the end. The only reason I'm putting the rest of this up here, don't even worry about it, except it is interesting. You're going to see this guy, if they want to quote him, they should at least go down to the next paragraph where he says, an open chain is one where, where's the little, the terminal joint, again, the terminal joint, but it's free. The waving of the hand is an open kinetic chain, which the action of the shoulder and the elbow are success. Okay, so look, he's saying, we're going to use this in a little bit, that this is an open chain. Okay? How many joints do you see involved with this? How many joints are moving in this thing? He just told you. 1, 2, 3. Got it? 3. This is the guy that everybody wants to quote. He says there's at least 3. It's possible to have 3. Keep that in mind. This guy, nobody would know about the other guy if it wasn't for this guy. Because back in the 80s, he had a series of courses that was entirely based upon promoting the idea of closed chain exercise. We're going to find out by the end of this thing that he had absolutely no idea he was doing open chain exercises the whole time. But that's what happens when you don't know that things have two ends. So he started really biasing this thing. If either set of limbs is involved in supporting your weight. So he's saying, when he said this thing that, okay, the end, it's not free anymore, it has to be fixed. And he suggested it had to be fixed on the ground. That's some stuff that people just took and ran with. They made it sound like it's only closed chain if your feet are on the ground. Meaning they couldn't be on a foot plate of a machine. That's the way some people interpret it, not everybody. But do you see, as soon as you give an example of what might close the end, and you don't give another possible example, most of the people aren't going to look for other ones that are similarly effective. They're just going to go, oh, it has to be supporting your body weight. And for some people, that became the defining feature of closed chain, was a body weight exercise. It has nothing to do with it. Could be, but it's not. And he goes along and talks about what an open chain is, where the end is free to move around. For numerous reasons, closed chain exercises are more effective in facilitating the healing process than open chains. People would read this. This article, I never knew about it until two different physicians in the same year handed it to me, because I was going, what was it, about 95? And I was going, guys, you keep telling me to do closed chain rehab on people. I'm not sure what that is. And both of them said the same thing. They said, oh, you know, it's like a squat. And here's what I learned. Anytime somebody says, oh, you know, that means they don't know. I promise you. So they both handed me this article. And I'm reading it and I'm going, this is actually embarrassing. Either I hope they didn't read it, because if they think this is clarifying, we're in trouble. You're going to see what I mean. Number one, that someone can make a statement that a certain type of exercise facilitates the healing process without identifying. What does that mean? That if you have sutures, they heal better? What does that mean? Chemotherapy works better? What are we talking about here? And it's not clarified. Oh, I see. Closed chain exercise provides a natural way of exercising. So it's like almonds and honey and air and closed chains. They're all natural. I got it. You've heard that joke before. This is what happens when somebody understands English. All this mess over here. Here we go, which is important because directly and indirectly it requires your body to conduct itself as it normally does. I don't even know what that means, to conduct itself as it normally does. Because if I do an open chain, my kidneys aren't going to function anymore. It's not going to conduct itself. This is such a propaganda statement, trying to sell us on something, that for physicians to say, this is really good and clarifying, I was appalled. And I still didn't know what I was talking about. I just knew this proved and meant nothing to me. Open chain exercises involve artificial stresses. So let me see. Waving my arm in space is an artificial stress? Because, right? With isolated movements, wait a minute, how did this become isolated movements? See, now he dove down into the leg extension world. When the original guy said, I told you that was going to come up, the original guy was like waving your arm in space. So right away, this is all becoming biased. And people are reading this. The person quoted the most after Steindler is this guy. Up until recently, it's changed a little bit. Every one of the things I ever received in school, later in school, when I was in school, nobody was talking about this. But everything that was ever handed out had this. Have you seen this list before? Open chain, closed chain, and here's some features on the side and their differences within those two types of exercise. And this is, again, it's in that article that's supposed to help me understand from these physicians that I respect. And here's how far I got down the list. Okay, the end segment, because there's only one end. One's free and one fixed. Now, I've heard that before. That doesn't bother me that much. I'm kind of getting used to that idea of terminology. Axis of motion. Does everybody know what an axis of motion is? I'm sorry to ask that question, but this guy certainly doesn't. And apparently none of the physicians I worked with did either. Because an axis of motion would be like, you know, when this convex part is moved upon by this one, there's an axis somewhere in here. Can you envision that? So, and when this one moves on this one, the axis is somewhere in here. It's always in the round part, the convex part. So he says in an open chain, the axis of motion is distal to the joint. This is, oh, that's distal. And that's proximal. And the axis is always out here. Does anybody see the problem with what he said? Like it's wrong? Small problem. And that's not the bad part. Everybody can be wrong. But why are they handing it to me like it clarifies? That's where I'm losing my mind about this thing. But wait! Thank goodness for a closed chain. You know why? Because over here, the axis of motion is both proximal and distal to the joint. Now, what does that mean? It's just a joke. What does that mean, though? Because this is the joint, isn't it? I mean, you know, I'm not wrong about that, am I? So there's an axis here and an axis up here. You know, they used to say when someone was really flexible when I was a kid, they called them double jointed. Maybe that's what he's talking about. It's a joke, too. Don't worry about it. So how are you feeling about this list of clarifying factors of open and closed chain? It's kind of disturbing. Here's one of the worst features also. A guy that worked for me for a while got out of school. He got out of school maybe, I don't know, 2002. He got the same list from his professor, only the professor had changed this one to say non-functional exercise, and this one said functional exercise. So completely plagiarized the whole list, but then changed the things at the top. And this is what, you know, high-level university stuff's come to, I guess. I don't know. That's why I watch cartoons. It's better. So what happened down here? Oh, this is important for you to know. Muscle contraction. In an open chain, like a leg extension, you can only do concentric contractions. Did you ever wonder why your patients could lift the weight and they couldn't lower it? Their leg just stayed, and they couldn't hold the weight either because that's isometric. So their leg just kept bending all the way around all the time because it's always concentric. According to, you know, it makes sense, right? Whoops, I go too far. Oh, I pushed the wrong button. This thing's got buttons all over it. Okay. Oh, but thank goodness for closed chain because now I can put the weight down. Because I got really tired of doing constant concentrics. That's craziness. Let's see, here's a fun one. Velocity. Predetermined velocity. Predetermined. Do you know where they're going with this? He's not talking about open and closed. He's trying to sell you to be anti-isokinetic machine. And physicians and professors, it's going right over their head that he's putting out propaganda that's against isokinetics. And the sad thing was, it wasn't long after that they had eccentric isokinetics. And you can do more than one joint on an isokinetic device. I mean, it's just, the whole thing is just glaringly sad and propaganda and full of holes, and there's nothing clarifying. In fact, it did nothing for decades but add to the problem. It really did. Before we start clarifying, this is that, by the way, this is the same book. When I was showing you the pictures of the two knees with the arrows and everything, it's the same, different editions, but it's the same book. And I love that. There's so many great things in there. But I would, first edition was better than the fifth. But here's what they said in the first edition and have continued to say about closed chains. In a closed chain, motion of one link at one joint will produce motion at all the other joints in the system in a predictable manner. We're going to see exactly what that means. We're going to take a look at that. We're going to back way up though, and I'm going to show you. I taught this to my daughter when she was 8. She's pretty much a closed chain expert now, or she was when she was 8. What's this? Let's call this a link. Is that okay? Let's call this an open attachment point, and this an open attachment point. Everybody good with that? That's about as difficult as it gets. We're just going to add some stuff to it. Everybody good? Now, something happened. This is a link that's open on one end. What happened here? This attachment point is closed. This link has one closed end. And when we stuck this other one on here, we made a little bit of a chain, but the chain is very open on both ends. Do you follow me? So you can have a link that's closed on one end, open at the other, and here's a question. I did this show in Las Vegas one time. It didn't do well. Okay, this is a link that's open, closed. This link is completely closed. The link is. The chain is open. Got it? Can you see that if I just kept doing that, it would just keep forever being open? Here's something I should tell you. There's two types of closure. Actually, what was interesting is when that one over there was in school, she did a little paper on this stuff, and she had pulled up a bunch of stuff I'd never seen before. And sent it to me, and I said, I don't know what any of that says. Looks pretty cool, though, and I stuck it in a file. I didn't throw it away. I stuck it in a file. I never can find my files, but it's in there. When I did pull it back out, because I was looking at all this stuff, and I really wanted to sit down one day and say, I want to figure this nonsense out. One of those papers said this really cool thing. It said there's two types of closure. And this is cool because one of them is really important to the exercise, the other one not so much. This is called form closure because there's actually a structural, if you will, connection. These things are truly stuck together by a form or by a structure or a material. You see what I'm talking about? If I took this and came over here and put it against the wall, this end is now closed. But unless I keep holding it there, it's not going to stay. So this one's closed by force, the force of compression. Are you with me? Now we use that in exercise a lot because if I put somebody on a leg press, I rarely nail their foot to the leg press to create form closure. We usually use compression and friction combined. And so there's a lot of form closure in our exercises that we create, a lot of force closure in the exercises, form closure inside of us, obviously. But understanding those two things, I think, is important because the whole world was struggling with what the heck is closed. Let's start with what closed means. So there's some interesting pieces of the puzzle. Now, if I stopped right there and took a piece of form and said, I'm not adding any more to that anymore. I'm going to bring the two ends together, the open ones, the open chain, I'm going to bring them together, and this is a closed chain because there are no open attachment points on any end of any link. Are you with me? That's it. That's how hard it is. There's a specific name for this. This guy, he actually in 1876 was the father, they called him the father of modern linkage theory or some nonsense like that. And he said, there was a whole bunch before this, but he was talking specifically about a type of chain. And he was talking about the motion of it. He wasn't even talking about forces, right? He was talking about motion. And in this chain, each link has only one relative motion to each other link. That is to say, motion at one occurs, motion at all the others occurs. That's back to that predictable idea, that one that joint structure and function said. If I move one, all the others move in a similar way. The problem with this one is it doesn't move at all. It's called a locked chain, but it is closed. It just doesn't move. We use this in architecture engineering all the time. We build trusses. You'll see a whole bunch of these connected, right? Triangles are really common in construction because they don't move. But he not only called it a specific type of chain, to him it really was just closed. I really kind of prefer, I like the names he used. I like the names that he used, locked, and I like the name constrained. This, if we had added one more link and then closed it, something unique happens here, very unique. It only happens in a chain with 4 joints that move in a specific plane, and that plane is closed. If this was a human body, there could be a joint that moved another way here. This thing could flop a little bit, but in this direction, it's closed in this plane. In fact, when you look in engineering books, the idea of a closed chain is in a section called planar systems. It is plane specific. And I don't mean sagittal, frontal, whatever. I mean the plane is always, a plane is perpendicular to the axes around which the hinge moves. That's the planar relationship that's closed. There's no flopping around of loose ends. Does that make sense? So, what is unique about these? This specific one, it's called constrained because he said what's unique about this is if one joint is manipulated, every other joint moves in a predictable manner. There's nothing questionable about this. If I only move this far, well, I get a proportional amount of motion at each. If I move this far, I get a proportional amount of motion at each. He's not saying we can predict how far you're going to move it. What we're predicting is the proportions of motion. Does that make sense? And you're thinking, maybe, what does that got to do with exercise? We'll get there. But I want you to think about this. In this chain, this is really fun. If I controlled this one, what happens to the others? In an open chain, you have to have a motor or set of muscles at every joint. Does that make sense? But he wasn't finished. He brought up this other one, unconstrained. Not very creative with words, this guy, but served the purpose. He could have called one Fred and the other one George or something, I don't know. But we added one more link, and it messes everything up. Because now what happens when the predictability is gone by adding one more. This one, before I took it apart, was very unique out of all of these things. And it is the only one that allows what, what joint structure and function said or described as movement of one link at one joint creates predictable movement of all other links at all other joints in the same manner. Every time, predictable. The problem is, joint structure and function uses a squat as their example of a closed chain. So when I remember loving this book and trusting this book and not knowing what to think about, I hadn't heard of this guy yet, and so I started thinking about a squat. I'm pretty sure the people who wrote joint structure and function never squatted, except maybe to toilet. So here's a squat, right? Did that look just like this one? Really? This one and this one. Predictable ranges of motion at each joint, exactly the same every time. You sure about that? Let's watch again. Okay. Those were the same. Not remotely. Different hip ranges, different knee ranges, different ankle ranges. If it was a closed chain, I would not have had a choice. Wouldn't have had a choice. So that threw me off right there. I was like, if a squat's closed chain, and if it's supposed to be predictable, something's wrong. Either closed chains aren't as predictable as they thought, or a squat is not one. That ended up being the case. So we're going to look at some exercise aspects of it here in a minute, but I really thought, a friend sent me this article a couple years after it came out, and I thought, someone has finally figured this out. And it's just a review of the concept and its applications. Okay, fine. They're not looking for anything earth-shattering here. A couple MDs, that's cool. And then I read this. It's the first article I'd ever read that mentioned Rouleau's name. I thought, this is going to be great. And then I read what if both ends of a system are fixed such that no movement can occur at either end, seems like they're going down both ends. Something's got to be working out here. It'll produce predictable movement pattern at all other joints in the chain. Then, as I continued to read the introduction, I became a little bit more disturbed. Not fatally, though. Here's Steinler again. Here's 1955 again. And here's depending on the loading of the terminal. We're back to that again before the introduction's over. Some not. Well, then they show pictures that really weren't that common up to this point. I've seen them a lot since. They are terrible representations of this topic, but let's go with it because they're the authors, not mine. Open chain system. I'm assuming this is a floor, some kind of foundation, some kind of base. They've got 1, 2, 3, 4 joints, 5 segments, 4 joints. They're showing that if this was some kind of propulsion mechanism that moved this joint, nothing else really had to move. That's what they seem to insinuate, which would seem to be correct also. Then they show this picture and call it a closed chain system, and they say that if this moved this joint, it wouldn't just straighten out like that because it's bound at the top, that there would be specific movement at those other joints. The problem, if we want to skip ahead, is that there are how many joints? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Is that going to be predictable? No, they are wrong. Can only be predictable with how many joints? 4. I'm going to give you another little piece of information. The reason this would show up to be predictable is if it was actually hanging from something, bound at the bottom and hanging from something like a ceiling, then gravity would be creating an influence on all these other joints that would make them all fall the same way. But if we took that system and laid it on the ground and only moved one joint, it would never move the same way once. So if we built that model and didn't understand the influence of gravity in it, we would think it worked. So, first problem I had with it was, if you're really going to be accurate, I can't assume that that's a floor and a ceiling. There's got to be a wall connecting it. That's what makes it closed. You can't have a floating around ceiling and a floating around floor because it has to be a completely closed situation. Do you see what I'm talking about? So that little arrow I put on, that little arrow I put on it, that line I put on it is what would have made it much closer to accurate if they would get rid of one of those joints. Here's where I got really sad. My whole world fell apart. All right, so here they are, and they're going to show us now examples of this open chain. Open chain examples. What do you think they used? They obviously understand multiple joint open chains. That's what they showed us. I'm hoping they're going to show the waving of the hand thing because that's what was in the book. And no. By all means, let's get 2 medical degrees. Let's work really hard for 12 to 20 years just so we can memorize and regurgitate the fact that the only possible open chain is not the one that Steinler mentioned, but the one that we seem to be focused on in exercise because we don't like it. Sorry, that was fast, but you know. How do you come up with, how do you show that and then show that as an example? How do you wouldn't do that, would you? Would you? You wouldn't do that. Well, what do you think is going to happen this time? Now we're going to have examples of closed chain. Surprise! And the thing is, doesn't it look just exactly like the open chain? Because it is. There's nothing at the top restraining that end on either the example of open chain or the exercise they used. That's my superhero voice or something. I don't know. I don't have a hammer, so I got to do the thing. Do you see what I mean? I mean, literally, that's just. There used to be a show called Sesame Street. Does anybody remember Sesame Street? Yeah. One of these things is not like the other. There's a little challenging things in there for 4-year-olds like that are just like this. These are exactly like each other. I don't get it. But I've gone to therapy and I feel a little better about it now. So something that is interesting though, nobody really explores open chains when it comes to exercise for 2 reasons. Number one, they think they got it covered because it's a leg extension, so we're good. What they need to do is go back and look at all the open chain multiple joint exercises because not only is that the bulk of exercise, that's the bulk of life. Every step you've ever taken was an open chain. Every time you sat down or stood up, it was an open chain. Anything you did that didn't have your top part attached to the same thing your feet were attached to was an open chain. And there's no debate about it. You just got to be older than 4 years old to see it. Sesame Street. The more you, when I really started to think, to recognize that, I just kept thinking I was crazy. What am I missing? Is it really that simple that humans can't see past the introduction of a mistake? They never go back and check it out to, beyond 1955? Turns out it's true. And the fun part is, for me, once I got over what a closed chain was and realized everything was open, open chains are the coolest things. Number one, I started calling this kind that we call a squat a supported open chain because if one end's fixed and the other end's open, well, which end that is matters on a world that's filled with gravity. So a supported open chain, this brain up here somewhere has to be in charge of every one of these joints to keep that thing from falling over. And this is quite a job we learn when we're somewhere between day 1 and year 1 of learning to stand in a supported open chain. Because if you think about it, it couldn't have been a closed chain because standing wouldn't be that hard and you'd fall down the same way all the time if it was predictable. And then you flip that around where gravity is always trying to fold this one up. Gravity is always trying to straighten this one out. It's got a completely different scenario going on. You can just relax there and it's all just going to hang. You relax on the other one, you're falling down. These things require very different brain orchestration, motor learning issues. And if we don't get that, we don't even become to appreciate what our brain's doing in terms of motor learning. That's how far this has gone to me, is that by trusting and being blind, we miss all the good stuff. We miss all the cool stuff. Now, unfortunately, our actual brains that are taking care of us don't know about the words or care about the words. Otherwise, we'd be messed up. If we had to actually know these things in order for our bodies to deal with them, our brains have been taking care of it the whole time. So the big thing is that it's not about the type of chain. It never was about the type of chain. The problem is people choose a team. Do you know what I mean by that? Oh, you like open chain exercise? You're not on our team. We're on the closed chain team. You guys are losers. I'm in the World Cup of closed chain over here, okay? But it never was about that. And you can't tell them that because they're really invested in their team. When really, if you're worried about joint forces, it's more about how the load was placed. But that's what isn't that what we said at the very end of the joint forces section? What happens between these two surfaces is based upon how you place the load. Well, it's exactly the same thing here. It never changed. So if I have these two things and I put the same amount of load on them, there's going to be very different forces at each joint. This one might have a little more compression at some of these things while trying to hold this up. This thing's liable to have some distraction while trying to hold this thing up. It's the opposite. Does that make sense? Here's our little 4-bar things. So if I push on it that way, every one of those little hinges is going to have a very specific place that's going to try to wear, that's going to erode, like arthritically, you know. If I was pulling that way, all these joints are receiving the exact opposite forces inside of them. And they're both closed chains. True ones. So what am I trying to say here? I'm trying to say that we shouldn't really, the term chain needs to get out of the discussion if we're talking about what should someone do or not do. The problem is, I'm not sure at this point, you would think after 50 years we'd be able to solve this. I'm not sure at this point we can undo the minds of the people that are writing the articles to get them to realize they're comparing open chains to open chains when they're recommending closed chains. Ankle weight. Very specific forces occurring here. And if someone had an ACL deficiency, there might be a significant amount of rotational component from the muscle against that direction of resistance at that point in time with that joint architecture in that current relationship, and that quadricep would be attempting to create potential translation of the tibia as a movement because there's no ACL preventing it. And this is the same leg extension. It's just as open chain, and it would be the exact opposite in terms of forces. So is it the exercise or the way we build it? Now, showing you this, be careful. Showing this is purely to get you to see that if I load something differently, the forces change. It never was about a leg extension versus something else. There are obvious reality problems with this. Someone laying on their back, holding their own leg, like this one, their hamstrings are liable to become part of the resistance, and they may not even be able to straighten out their leg all the way. So there are other issues. I just wanted to give you these examples to show that it really was about the forces. It's the ankle weight and its current relationship to the knee. That's the only thing that changed. They're both open chain leg extensions. But there are other ways, if we get creative, that can solve. It doesn't have to be one or the other. It could be in between and still change the joint forces. There are a lot of ways, and the person doesn't have to hold their own leg up, and there's all kinds of, this is the fun part though, is once we get away from the dogma, from the belief systems, from the repetition, just repeating words over and over and believing in them, when we start to see true science of it, and that it's not a battle, and it's not a fight, and there's no team to choose. The only team is me and my patient against not getting well. So if I can improve the forces and create a better exercise and still something that doesn't have to have a $3,000 piece of equipment or something, then I'm going to get a lot done. And if I am worried about somebody who does have an ACL deficiency, either because it's partially torn or it's completely gone or whatever, and then quite frankly, if it's completely gone, I think your worries are over because you can't make it worse. But now we start to understand forces for what they really are. And if you actually had a machine, and I'm not saying this is it, I don't even know what brand this is, but if you actually had a machine that had a profile of resistance that gave you more where you were more tolerant of it, and gave you less where you were less tolerant of it, to a proportional manner that was appropriate for the individual, their dilemmas, and human structure, this would be the best version of the exercise. There is no way to objectively vilify, there's no way to objectively turn this machine into a bad guy if we really, number one, have a decent one, which is rare, very rare. Most of these guys who make them haven't a clue. At least people who make cars know the car is supposed to run. I don't know what these guys are thinking. It just needs paint and some kind of weights or something and we're good, I think is all they know. But this really could be the best way. I'm not saying it is today. I'm not saying, but it can be. So let's take a break. So we were going to discuss how all of this started in the first place. Has anybody been a physical therapist? No, nobody's going to want to answer this.
Yes, go ahead and answer. Yes, go ahead.
Was anybody here a physical therapist in 1990?
Alguém era fisioterapeuta em 1990 já?
Você admitiu, relaxa.
Só eu que
tenho verdade.
So, in the early 80s, maybe before that, let's just say in the mid 80s, they started perfecting this ACL reconstruction process. And they're still working on it and altering, as you know, altering the sources of the grafts and that kind of thing. But in the beginning, as you know, one of the primary versions was a bone patellar tendon bone graft, autograft, because it came from you. And I hated them because the patellofemoral problems associated with these things were a nightmare. The dysfunction created by taking that graft from a third of the patellar tendon was just, the grafts actually did pretty well themselves. What they did, of course, was take a piece of the body out and weave it through, as you know, and put some screws in. But as soon as you remove a piece of the body from the body, it starts, well, it's dead. And when they, an hour later, put it back in, screwed it down tight, closed you up, started the relatively slow process of revascularization. So it had to get hooked up to the blood supply again. Well, there was, I guess they did some research, but they knew that over time, immediately after surgery, there was a loss of integrity in that graft site because the tissue was dying. And I think they had something like, do you remember? Not 6 weeks, 6 weeks was short. Something like 12 weeks they were really concerned about. At some point in time they decided that 3 months or something like that, there was a significant amount of blood hooked back up again. And so they were less concerned about losing more of the graft. Now, of course, you don't want to tear the new one regardless, but I think they were less concerned about continued deterioration. So it was during those years of creating the protocols, the rehabilitation protocols for those things, where they said, you know, someone along the way figured out that a leg extension had shear associated with it. The concern was, did it have the ability to produce enough shear that it might disrupt the newly inserted graft prior to it getting revascularized? That was the big question as I understood it back then when we were doing this, was we are going to wait X number of weeks before we reintroduce the leg extension for that reason. Now realize, to introduce any quadricep loaded activity after taking a third of the patellar tendon out was always going to be pretty light because it hurt. That was the major healing part of the deal, in fact, was waiting for that graft site the donor site to recover too. Anyway, the key was, though, this word, when. It never was, let's don't do leg extensions. It was, when can we safely reintroduce them? I don't know when it became that we shouldn't do them at all. And the reason I question that is twofold. I don't ever remember anybody ever saying that they had a patient ever tear a reconstructed ligament during the rehab process. I'm sure it has happened. Everything has happened once somewhere. I don't ever remember anybody ever. And we were all reintroducing leg extensions at some point in time. In fact, within just a few years, they were recognizing that you could do it sooner and sooner and sooner if the patellofemoral area was tolerant of it. But one of the ways to get that to heal was to introduce some force across it, because tissue responds to force positively if it's an appropriate force. So that's a dilemma when you've got something that you need to introduce force into the tissue, but you're afraid of something. But introducing, it was about amounts. How much? And the funny thing was that for all the extended rehab time we used to have, we were still testing them on isokinetic, open chain, single joint, knee flexion, knee extension challenges. And again, the only problem I personally remember anybody having, or only problem I remember anybody even talking about in the literature, was at the patellofemoral joint. So I think it's interesting that along the way, the pendulum swung so far that even healthy people shouldn't do leg extensions because it's bad for your ACL. And I don't know if you're aware that that's out there, but it's everywhere. There's too much shear in a leg extension. They don't even say with how much weight. They don't even say for who. They don't say for someone. It's just bad now. Let's go look at mechanisms of injuries for ACLs. And I'm sure you're all very familiar with this. I think it's funny that there's always some conflict in the information, no matter how sure everybody is. But non-contact ACL injuries are typically produced through being loaded through the leg, right? So you're vertical, you're not laying down. There's a considerable valgus introduced, concurrent with knee flexion and tibial rotation. And this specific article is calling it internal rotation. This specific article brings up the same points, valgus, but they bring up internal or external rotation. And I think it's interesting because we shouldn't be using terms like internal rotation anyway of the tibia, because it doesn't tell us what's happening at the knee. If this turns in space internally, there's a foot down here somewhere, okay? And if this turns and the leg goes with it, was there any knee rotation? No. That's the problem with saying internal tibial torsion, is that torsion of the tibia, it turning in space, doesn't necessarily indicate any actual knee rotation. And it turning in space, even if this sits, well, this is interesting. I've seen some people describe it as you're coming in, you're landing from maybe having jumped and rebounding a basketball or something. And so we're landing, and the foot collapses, and we introduce this valgus, internal tibial rotation, but sometimes they say it's actually external knee rotation, because if the hip rotates even more, even though this was internal, if this is more, it's still external rotation of the knee. This is the problem with saying internal rotation of a bone, but what happened to this bone? Because if this bone went with it, then there was no rotation of the knee. Internal rotation of the tibia tells me nothing. And that's why there's sometimes the dilemma of, well, it can be internal or it can be external, and maybe that's true, but there's a very different situation in the ACL, whether there's internal or external. Because if this is twisted this direction, the ACL wraps around the PCL, and that's very different from if it's twisted, I'm going the other way. If it's internally rotated at the knee, the ACL is wrapped around the PCL, and it gets tight fast. If this happened, and it's actually externally rotated because this internally rotated on top of it, it doesn't get tight as fast. So it says either, and maybe it can be either, but they're not exactly the same. And then, of course, this person's doing it in their dress shoes and their skirt. So I don't even know why that's part of the mechanism of injury. Maybe a different color skirt and different heels. I don't know. But here's the real life version of all that. There's your precipitating factors. And of course, it's not the position alone, it's the abrupt forces. This person is usually decelerating when it happens. So, how many people have ever been hurt? How many people have ever torn an ACL from doing a leg extension? None that anybody can find. There's not any in medical recorded history. So I'm not sure what to do with that. I'm not sure why it's a problem. I'm not sure. Now, if you were to do things abruptly, there was a young man on social media the other day having his clients kick the machine up and catch it. Now, if anything was going to tear an ACL on a leg extension, that young man, who I think he thinks is rehabilitating it, is actually working as hard as he can to try to get a leg extension to tear an ACL. But I would like to, he still hasn't done it, so apparently it's a pretty tough thing to do. But controlling this exercise is putting such a small amount of force compared to the actual mechanisms of injury that it's ridiculous. And that people historically could do this exercise, this exercise after being reconstructed and do just fine is an important piece of the puzzle. And by the way, the problem with avoiding leg extensions entirely, there is, and I'm not kidding, no other exercises that accomplishes the same thing. There's not one other exercise that accomplishes the same thing. Anything you do in standing, by the time your leg is straight, it is unloaded. You have no torque of resistance on your knee. The line of resistance is falling through your knee. Your quadricep has no reason to work at full extension. And I cannot tell you how many people, I would get these clients, these athletes, these football players, whatever, and they come in and say they had some problem, some little thing. And their therapist said, go see this guy and see if he can take care of the rest of it. So the guy would come in. So what's the story? I'm doing great. I can squat 500 pounds again, and I can run, I can jump. There's really no big deal. And I said, well, then why are you here? Because I have to eat lunch and stuff. What are you doing here? Okay. Well, he said, well, no, it's just no big deal. Sometimes when I walk, it just kind of does that. I'm like, oh yeah, it's no big deal. You're back out on the field for 3 months. It's just walking down the street where it's a little problem. That's going to show up on the field someday. I'm sorry, but there's a lot of force going on out there. And you know what it always was? If I straightened out his leg all the way, he couldn't contract his quadricep at that position. I could bend his knee 5 degrees, he could tighten it. Straighten it all the way, he couldn't tighten it. But when did he ever do that in exercise, in rehab? Back in the day when we actually did quad sets, does anybody remember quad sets where you just sit and do an isometric? But you do it right after surgery and the knee's still swollen, so you're not doing it in full extension. And you stop doing it, the protocol kicks it out before you get the swelling out of there, so you never do it in full extension. And you don't do any other exercise that challenges that with resistance. And it's still not there. And they have sped up the protocols, I don't know about here, but insurance companies in the States have dictated, in essence, how long people can come for therapy. So magically, people get well with their ACL stuff in 12 visits. They're done. Well, that's because that's all they get paid for. They're not getting any better for a year. It's still going to take a year for tissues to heal. It takes forever for the nervous system to get hooked back up and all the sensory mechanisms to even work inside of there, for their brain to even use their muscles correctly on the field. And oh, by the way, don't forget, if they're an NBA player and they're making about, $5 million a game, they don't want them on the bench. And it's just amazing to me they're not worried about their investment, over the next few years. They want them out there as fast as possible. So it's not that the rehabilitation process hasn't gotten better. People don't heal any faster. We're just missing steps, mostly because of money. Sorry, that's just reality. So, yeah, here's where, in this closed chain activity, this functional activity is where you get hurt. In this non-functional activity, isn't. But remember, there is only one reason why we rehab athletes anyway. So we can put them right back into the activity that they hurt themselves in. You know this, right? Not so it's like, listen, you haven't been able to walk here for a while. Wasn't that important to you, this walking thing? Why are you going back to play soccer? Well, what are you talking about? That's the only reason for... Have you ever have anybody that has a car wreck and they spend like a year getting over their car wreck just to go have another car wreck? That's sports rehab. I'm sorry, but I wouldn't even do surgery on a kid if I was a surgeon if he was going to go play sports again. Don't waste my time. Or actually, you'll pay my taxes next time because we'll get to do this again. And my gosh, what would these poor people do that make braces? They'd be homeless if we didn't put these kids back out into sports. It's pathological. So here's an interesting thing. You know, there's the mounting evidence that we shouldn't do forceful quadricep contractions. Aggressive quadricep loading can induce non-contact anterior cruciate ligament injury. Doesn't that sound like they really took a bunch of athletes and just made them tighten their quads really hard and tore their ACLs? That's what it exactly says, isn't it? If you didn't read this article, you would think that athletes did a leg extension or just were sitting around one day drinking beer and tightened their quadricep and their ACL just fell apart. Oh, but wait, let's read about this. It says down here, did I make this bigger? No. Methods. They took 13 fresh, frozen knees out of cadavers, right? So they were frozen like from the supermarket. And then they pulled on them until they broke. They pulled anteriorly until the ACLs broke. Because that's what quadriceps do, is pull on fresh frozen ACLs until they break with no other muscle in sight. There's nothing else going on in this knee. There's no hamstrings in, you know, athletes that are fresh frozen. And there's no brain contracting those hamstrings or anything, right? So this is total reality right here. You know what they proved? You can pull hard enough on something frozen to break it. Well, maybe they thought it out first. That's pretty much all they found out. That has nothing to do with the quadricep contraction, because the one thing I'm pretty sure of about a quadricep contraction, it's occurring with everything else that the brain chooses to recruit also. Does that make sense? Gastroc, hamstrings, everybody, everything. This is interesting though. Something we'd actually been doing for decades with people in leg extensions. Voluntary enhanced co-contraction of hamstrings during leg extensions actually unloads the ACL. For all the research that's been done on open versus closed, and them talking about in an open chain there's no co-contraction, I wondered about that one day. So we got an EMG and we put it on the hamstrings during leg extensions. And if you go really slow with not much weight, the hamstrings don't do anything because they don't have to do anything. If you go really fast with the light weight, those hamstrings kick in dramatically, more than the quads, at the point of deceleration because they're stopping you. The brain doesn't want you to break your knee in half. So the idea that there's no co-contraction is based upon when. When are you testing this? I mean, what makes you think there's not? With speed, there is. With heavy weight, there is. Are they testing every possibility? This is the problem with research. You look at one thing, you've proven nothing. All valid research says on the last line it says, requires more study. And if it doesn't say that, I'm out. Anyway, yeah, come to find out if you actually do a leg extension and intentionally try to tighten everything, including your hamstrings, they work even harder at your beck and call in order to reduce that force. So, you start going through a lot of research, and I just brought up a few of them. But all of these guys, every one of these people that was comparing various open to closed exercises, open chain to closed chain, they didn't do a closed chain for the closed chain. They did an open chain that was loaded through the limb. And then the other open chain was the one that was loaded tangentially. So they're really comparing two different loadings, not two types of chains. So every one of these things that someone would pull up and go, here's 100 articles that say closed chains are safer. The problem is there's not one closed chain performed in any of them. And that's not debatable. They're just wrong about what they... So if your foundations are faulty from the beginning, if you're calling something green and it's as red as can be, and it turns out that green just kills people, it really was red. So watch out for that red stuff. That's why the bulls and the whole, yeah. This one's really funny, this last one. Kinetic chain exercise. This one's gotten so bad that they don't even call leg extensions open chains. They're just saying, when you read this article, it says kinetic chain. It doesn't say which type. And you're going, well, what are they comparing? You get to the bottom, and they are literally just, there's one type to them now. It's not even open or closed. It's just squats versus everything else. And now, one thing I have to say, for the right person, for the right goal, for the right reason, done appropriately, there's absolutely nothing wrong with squats either. So none of this has been anti-anything except misinformation. Here's another problem with all of this stuff. Start looking at joint forces. And I mentioned this to you clear back to when we were looking at the two pictures of the knee with the arrows, when we first started looking at that, the one from the book. And I mentioned, but if you're on a machine that loaded it more here than here, so what we're talking about is the torque of resistance. Where is it heavy and where is it light? And we get to manipulate that. And certainly a machine can manipulate that. These guys, I mean, where I'm going with this is how rare. If you get 80 studies on joint forces, the vast majority of them do not recognize torque. They simply write down an amount of weight that was applied, which means it was really a specific profile. It was a specific amount of weight at a specific position, and it was zero somewhere else. So these guys, look at this. They compared a squat to active knee extension. And to control the variables of resistance, they used 25% of the body weight. Very plainly, they used 25% of the body weight over here with leg extension and 25% of the body weight with the squat. Anybody have any questions? I do. What are the possibilities here? Well, did they include my lower leg's weight in the 25%? Or was it 25% of my body weight plus whatever my calf weighs? And you're going, well, that's really not a big deal. And I go, you're probably right. But this one's a big deal. Because if I added 25% of your body weight to your total body weight to do a squat, we've got a problem. Or did they offload you by 75% so that you're doing 25% of your body weight? Which would be, in my opinion, reasonable if you want to compare apples to apples instead of apples to rocks. And so, I got the little citation, went to the references, there's a couple hundred references, I looked it up, and it's the same authors. Other piece of research, they're citing their own research. Okay, so I go to the Journal of Orthopedic and Sports Physical Therapy that this one was supposed to be in also, only there's not one there. In fact, it says, submitted and under review. So this thing that they cited, this graph right here and everything that developed that graph, actually never got published. It was submitted and apparently denied. And I'm sad to say, I bet that whoever denied it completely missed the part about the body weight stuff. I bet that went over their head too. My point is that most of these articles don't mention torque. They're saying 25% they're using an ankle weight, or they're saying 25 pounds they're using ankle weight. That's 25 pounds applied maximally at one end of the range and 0 resistance at the other end of the range. That doesn't make for a valid, variable controlled piece of research. That is a resistance variable that is unidentified and not controlled. And without looking at just leg extensions by themselves, with 2 or 3 different opposing resistance profiles, to see if everything they think about leg extensions even occurred within every version of a leg extension. Those are some really important questions for supposedly really smart people. Or some pretty reasonable ones for some 4-year-olds watching Sesame Street. All of this is probably not going to kill anybody. Maybe. But I think it's interesting that it does shine a light on a lot of the way every industry does business. And yes, even the medical industry. And so many times the things we're afraid of, and we create all these scare tactics around, we assume there's all these things, oh, this is going to tear your ACL. That's bad for your ACL. But there's never been one torn by it. There's not one justifiable piece of evidence that that machine is going to hurt an ACL. So where did this fear and where did these stories come from? And why do we feel so like we learned something when we repeat something we've never validated? We never even questioned. And I don't think they're tough questions. Now, certainly we can't question everything we do every day, or we'd be completely disabled. We wouldn't be able to function. But at least once a day, something should show up on the radar that we keep doing over and over and go, why do I keep doing this? Because it's on the schedule? Why? I don't know. I just think that kind of adds some fun to the deal, quite frankly. I think this is a valuable quote. I've been showing it to people for years. This idea that it's mostly because something's been around for a long time that we keep it around for a long time. Not because we sit back and go, yep, it's proved itself again every day. And that's, like I said, that's every industry. It really is. It's just humans. It's tough. And then I like this quote too from this other guy that I met a couple times, and he's pretty amazing. He died a few years back. But when you change the way you look at things, without a doubt the things you look at really do change in lots of ways. So that was a long evening with some sugar at the end, so that was good, right? Sugar and coffee, that's good. But I hope, above all, that there were some things that sparked an interest and some things to look at, some things to question, and that carries over to a lot of other areas of exercise and what we do with folks. And that's really the process. It is us that improves our profession. There's not somebody out there that we're sitting and waiting on to improve things for us. They've got their own agenda. They're doing research for their own reasons. And rarely is it the good of our clients that's sitting right in front of us. That's our responsibility. And hopefully our passion. So thank you all for being here. Thank you.